Hello everyone. In this session, we are going to see how to choose a statistical test to establish whether a statistical association exists between an exposure variable and an outcome variable. So, what I will try to do in this lecture is to give you an introduction into the names of the different statistical tests that are available, the commonly used ones, and then tell you in which situations you should use them. Okay, let us go. The learning objectives for this particular session will be to name the various commonly used statistical tests, to describe the preconditions to select a statistical test, and you have to apply the correct statistical test for the problem at hand. So, at the end of this lecture, you should be able to remember some of the names of these statistical tests and think through when these statistical tests have to be applied for a particular research problem. In practice, we apply statistical tests to confirm if our study results have arisen due to chance or due to a true effect. So, if the statistical test says that it is not likely due to chance, then we say that it is probably in fact a true effect. It is important to apply the correct statistical test to arrive at a valid conclusion. The statistical test will not care what data you have. If you apply, it will give you a result, but that is not how it should be done. The statistical test that has to be applied has to be chosen correctly for the particular type of variables at hand. So we will have to think of a number of things before we select a statistical test. So these are some of the questions you will need to ask yourself in order to select an appropriate statistical test. The first question is, how many variables are there in a given situation? You might have one exposure variable and one outcome variable. For example, you might have the smoking status as well as the disease status. What is the nature of the dependent and independent variable? And by nature, I mean what is the type of variable? Is it categorical? Is it continuous? It is ordinal, etc. How many categories are there in the categorical variable? So these are called levels. For example, if a question has only two levels, yes or no, then it is called a binomial variable. If a categorical variable has more than two levels, let's say stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, then that variable is called a multinomial variable. This also determines what type of statistical test we are supposed to use. Does the continuous variable follow a normal distribution? If you have a continuous variable in your question, does it follow a normal or not normal distribution? So that determines whether we use parametric tests or non-parametric tests. Let's say you have blood pressure and you have to check whether blood pressure follows a normal distribution in your data. If yes, you use parametric tests. If no, you use non-parametric tests. And finally, you ask yourself, is there any pairing in the data or variables? Sometimes you might have paired data in a way like this. You measure the scores of a particular group of participants before you give particular training, and after you have given the training, you calculate their scores again. So this is called paired data. Sometimes you might have matched data. For example, matched case control studies have one or more controls for a given case. So these are called matched data sets. If you have any sort of pairing or matching in your data, then the type of statistical test that you will use are going to be different from the regular ones. Just to recollect what we have said so far, the questions that you need to ask yourself are, how many variables are there in your particular problem? What is the nature of the dependent and independent variable? How many categories are there in the categorical variable if you have a categorical variable? Does the continuous variable follow a normal distribution or not if you have a continuous variable? And is there any pairing in the data or variables that you have collected? So once you answer these questions, then the choice of a statistical test becomes clearer. So before we proceed to the actual statistical tests, I would like you to consider this. How do we check whether a particular continuous variable follows a normal distribution or not? There are many ways in which you can test this assumption. There are some formal ways and there are some informal ways. As a general rule, small samples less than 30 are not considered normally distributed. That is, a sample size of less than 30 is not usually considered as normally distributed. Conversely, large samples may or may not be considered as normally distributed. You have to check them more formally. There are visual methods of checking whether a variable follows normal distribution. For example, you could draw a histogram, a PP plot or a QQ plot and see whether the bell-shaped curve is followed or not. You could compare the standard deviation and mean of a particular variable and see whether the standard deviation is very high compared to the mean. Usually, if the standard deviation is 2 or 3 times more than the mean, then it is probably not normally distributed. And there are some formal statistical tests to check whether the distribution is normal or not normal. These are called Kolmogorov-Smirnov and Shapiro-Wilk test. Interestingly, these two tests should have non-significant p-value to say that the variable is normally distributed, because the null hypothesis states that the variable is normally distributed. So you have to accept the null hypothesis, and therefore we need a non-significant p-value. Here I have shown you some variables, and you can pause the video here and see which of these are dependent or independent variables. I'll give you a few seconds to pause. I hope you have seen through this list and tried to decide which of them are dependent and independent variables, and you might have come across the confusion that some variables can both be dependent as well as independent. So the point that I'm trying to make here is the research question or the researcher decides which of these variables are dependent and independent for a given research problem. Okay, so the statistical tests are dependent on your understanding of the variable, and you have to tell the computer program or the statistician which of these are dependent and which of these are independent, right? I told you about paired and unpaired data, right? So let us see some of the situations where you will have pairing or matching in your data. As I said before, pre-test, post-test samples are paired data. Crossover trials, where you have two groups which receive interventions A and B at one time point. After a certain time point, you exchange the interventions and give them. So these are called crossover trials. These are again matched samples. The other example is matched case control study, where you select multiple controls for a given case, and then this situation is also considered a paired situation. And cluster samples. For example, this applies to population level surveys, where you are selecting people based on a complex multi-stage cluster design, where many people are selected from a particular cluster. So those situations are also in a way matched, and you have to use a particular type of statistical test when addressing those types of data. If you have one or more independent variables, and if they are either interval or categorical in nature, and if the nature of the dependent variable is either interval or normal, which is a continuous variable, you can use multiple linear regression. And if the dependent variable is categorical, you will be using multiple logistic regression. Here we are continuing the previous example. One independent variable which is unpaired, but it has two or more levels, and there are two or more dependent variables. And if the nature of the dependent variable is interval or normal, then we use one-way MANOVA, which is nothing but one-way multivariate analysis of variance. These are slightly complicated and slightly advanced methods. It will just help you to remember their names, and this will require some expert statistical help for application. If you have two or more independent variables which are categorical in nature, but they are unpaired, and there is only one dependent variable, and if that dependent variable is normal, then you can use factorial ANOVA. If the dependent variable is ordinal or interval, that is not normally distributed, you can use ordered logistic regression. And if the dependent variable is categorical, you use factorial logistic regression. If there are two or more independent variables and two or more dependent variables, then you need to use some complex statistical methods such as multivariate multiple linear regression. And the same holds good for two or more dependent variables only. There are no independent variables. You have a bunch of variables and you want to make sense of them. Then if they are interval or normally distributed, you use canonical correlation or factor analysis. You must be really wondering about the number and the names of the statistical tests which we have used so far, and thinking whether these are really applicable in practice. So in order to make things easier for you, I have prepared this table where you can use it as a ready reckoner when you are trying to decide a statistical test. The rows in this table show what is the type of comparison you have, and the columns of this table show what tests to use depending upon whether it is an independent sample or paired sample, and whether it is normally distributed or not normally distributed. So let us take one by one and see how it goes. The first comparison is a categorical variable versus a categorical variable. For example, treatment type versus gender. Treatment type surgical or conservative, and gender is male or female. There are only 2 levels in each categorical variable. In that case, you use a chi-square test if assumptions are met, or Fisher's exact test if the assumptions are not met. For independent samples, if the samples are paired, such as before after matched case control, then you use paired samples test, which is McNemar test. Then the second row is categorical versus categorical. Example, disease severity versus religion. So stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 versus religion. There may be more than 2 religions or even 4 5 religions. So if you want to compare the religion with disease severity, you have more than 2 levels in each of the categorical variable. The same tests are applicable: chi-square test for independent samples or Fisher's exact test for independent samples. And for paired samples, there is something known as McNemar's test extended. Then categorical versus quantitative. You have 2 treatment types, that is conservative and surgical versus mean BP. So mean BP here is continuous or quantitative, but the categorical variable has only 2 levels, that is surgical as well as conservative. If these are independent samples, you use student's t-test if the continuous variable follows a normal distribution, and if not, you use the Wilcoxon rank sum test. If it is a paired situation, that is before and after situation, you use the paired t-test if it is a normally distributed continuous variable, and if it is a not normally distributed variable, you use the Wilcoxon signed rank test. The fourth situation is categorical versus quantitative, but now the categorical variable has more than 2 levels. So 3 treatment types, let's say treatment A, treatment B, treatment C, and mean BP. Here there are more than 2 levels in the categorical variable, so we change our strategy. If it is independent samples, you use one-way ANOVA if it is a normally distributed continuous variable. ANOVA stands for analysis of variance, and if you are looking at a not normally distributed continuous variable, you use the Kruskal-Wallis test. And if it is a situation where you have paired samples, then you use repeated measures ANOVA if the continuous variable is normally distributed, and you use the Friedman's test if the continuous variable is not normally distributed. And the final situation is a quantitative variable versus a quantitative variable. For example, age versus height, height versus weight, or something like that. Here the number of groups are not relevant because there are no categorical variables. If the samples are independent, you use Pearson correlation analysis or regression analysis if the variables follow normal distribution, or you use Spearman's rank correlation if the variables follow non-normal distribution. And if the samples are paired, then we go on to more advanced methods. So what I would like to say as a take-home message or as a concluding statement is that there are several statistical tests which are available. You have to understand why statistical tests are used and what statistical test to use for a given situation. I hope this table helps you understand some of the complex statistical tests and the situations that you should be using them. So the take-home messages for this session will be: you have to consider a number of things before you select a test. You should also check whether the assumptions for a given statistical test are met, and the results of the statistical tests should be interpreted cautiously with the context. I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you very much.